This is Paul. I've spent a fair amount of time. I've spent some time watching this video, and this is a really important video, I think, in terms of the progress of the conversation. Now, figuring out how to frame this video and make this video more intelligible is not easy, because there are times when all three of them can get very meta, as Jonathan calls it, towards the end of the video. And I think actually one of the best ways to approach this video is from the end and then go back to the beginning in order to understand what's going on. Last week I made a comment about this comment. I want to know what the point of this breakdown is, and I'm not finding it in the first 3 minutes. Well, yeah, that's true. You might want to know what the point of this video is, and even though this video has a teaser at the beginning, I don't know that the teaser necessarily gets at what this video is about. I think the title gets at it, but why Christianity? But I think so then John left a comment on today's video where I talked about it a little bit. So John left this comment. Thanks as always, Paul. I would like to make something clear, which I made explicit at the end of my discussion with Jonathan and Jordan. This is that the core of my concern is not my personal salvation. I understand that this issue frustrates some of your viewers, but that was not and should not be my main concern. My main concern is addressing the meta crisis and the meaning crisis. For this, there are three options. First is business as usual, which does not seem to be a good idea at all. The second is for all Christians or Buddhist groups to unify and then convert the world. While the probability of this is not zero, I think history provides good examples as to why it's very low. The third is to afford dialogos between faith, wisdom communities in the hope of affording a distributed cognition that can address our situation. While the probability of this is also low, I believe, given historical examples and what is happening right now, that I call the advent of the sacred, it is a significant enough possibility that we should consider it. Thank you again, Paul, for your kind and generous treatment of my work. Okay, so at some point, I very much, in fact, I'm thinking about asking John and Jonathan to do a conversation just about this phrase, the advent of the sacred. As Christian communities are getting closer and closer to Advent, there's a lot in that phrase to talk about. And he used it with Jordan, so it would be a really good thing to sort of pause on. But my purpose of this video is not necessarily to pause on that per se, but to take a look at what we're trying to do to address the meaning crisis or the meta crisis, and this idea of converting the whole world to Christianity or Buddhism, or Christianity and Buddhism, yada, yada, yada. And this gets into the much deeper conversation with John about the legacy religions, as they're called. Now, this morning I made a tiny little members video about Matthew Peugeot's long conversation, almost 3 hours. So the first 2 hours, he's talking about what he's talking about. And again, Matthew has a particular way of going about these conversations. And if my rambling will drive you crazy, his will drive you crazy. But he comes back because he wants to address this question of, earlier in the conversation, says, why don't I address Christianity? And he comes back with a little illustration about a lock and a key. And when I first heard it, I was trying to get my mind around it. But this is the way listening to Matthew is. When he first says something, it's like, well, where are we going? What are we doing? But if you listen to him and you sort of sit with it and think about it and let it sit a while, it can sort of start to become clear. He is very much not a first 3 minute, get to the point kind of person. But he talks about this lock and the key, and I saw this in terms of, in many ways, the history of Christianity and Chesterton's point about sort of the regular death of Christianity. When we use that word Christianity, what are we talking about? And this is something that I have thought a lot about for a lot of years. And I wouldn't say I've come up with an answer that completely satisfies myself. Because on one hand, so for a while, John was looking at this word hyperobject. So Christianity would be a hyperobject. It's not that it doesn't mean nothing. And actually, T. Grog made the point this morning in Luke's live stream And I can very much understand what he's saying, because we sort of want Christianity to be a thing, like an Amazon box that has nice sides and has something within it. And you can say, this is Christianity, this is not Christianity. And while I'm not saying you can't, now I'm not saying that you can never say that. At the same time, when we're talking about something enormous like Christianity, it's hard to sort of see the edges of it and get our minds around it and approach it in the kinds of ways that are left, right. My dyslexia always baffles me. My left brain, the emissarian brain, sort of wants to do. So again, if you go back to Ian McGilchrist and you talk about right brain and left brain, or I prefer master brain and emissarian brain, or even master mind, mind brain and emissarian mind. The emissarian mind wants to take something like Christianity and have it in a box, and have it be a box, and have all kinds of things in it, and wants not Christianity to be the same thing. The difficulty is that is just not going to happen. And it's not going to happen for a whole variety of reasons. And so we wrestle with it. And again, very early on in the channel, it was immediately evident that when we're talking about, early on in the channel, talking about Jordan Peterson and is Jordan a Christian, is not Jordan a Christian, very quickly someone will say, well, what is your definition of a Christian? Now that's a little bit easier than Christianity, because downstream from Tom Holland's thesis, what isn't impacted by Christianity? And at a point they're going to talk about syncretism and what hasn't Christianity impacted in the world today? Maybe if you find some tribe somewhere that has been completely isolated from this network we call civilization, maybe you can hopefully have some sort of Christianity-free clean room. But Jesus has traveled and smuggled into just about everything. So at this point, you certainly cannot talk about a Jesus-free Islam. I don't know that you can talk about a Jesus-free Buddhism or Hinduism or almost anything else in the world today, in that some Jesus code has gotten into a whole lot of everything. Now, I want to be fair and not to suggest that other codes from other religions haven't also smuggled in and snuck into Christianity or Christian civilization or the West or something like this. It's simply an impossible issue that we really can't avoid, because on one hand, the terms must mean something. Now, what is the framing of this conversation? Jonathan and Jordan had a conversation about Jordan's coming into Christianity. And as a number of my videos, including the video released Monday, September 23, talked about, and also the video that sort of sees as two pictures, one of Jordan and one of Eric Weinstein and Game B. The meaning crisis, the meta crisis, the poly crisis, it seems, well, Jordan just released a conversation that I haven't listened to it yet. I've jumped into a few parts to listen to a little bit of it. Just released a conversation he had with Brett Weinstein and Heather Hying. And a big part of, or at least the initial part of this conversation, he talks about, well, why don't we just let him say it.
Had many discussions. Always a pleasure. We concentrated on two issues today and then branched out into many others. The first is Brett's plan to foment a celebration in Washington, D.C. on the 29th of September. The movement is Rescue the Republic. The website is jointheresistance.org, www.jointheresistance.org. On X, the handle is @RescueRepublic. Okay, so that's on the 29th of September. What is that? Well, that's what we discussed. That was one of the main issues we discussed. It's a celebration. It brings together musicians and comedians and speakers. What would you say of the alternative media, of the alternative entertainment enterprise, of the alternative political system that seems to be gathering itself around Trump? Kennedy will speak there, Tulsi Gabbard, for example. All the speakers haven't yet been identified. I'm going to attend. So this is an invitation to all of you to come to that on the 29th. You can get, as I said, you can get information at jointheresistance.org. So we talked about that. We talked about, and then we talked more philosophically, scientifically about the convergence that Heather and Brett and I all see between the advanced findings of evolutionary biology and the proclamations, let's say, the historically grounded proclamations of the theologians and the religious types. And that was associated with a conversation we also had about Peterson Academy, this new online university that launched 3 weeks ago. Heather and Brett lecture there, but so do a number of the figures on the more cognitive science and theological side who seem to be integrally involved in this integration, this new integration. John Vervaeke and Jonathan Pajot, perhaps first and foremost.
And so Jordan's sort of straddling this thing, okay? And I'm trying to remember what it used to be called. Okay, so Join the Resistance. And to me, this is sort of the techno-political approach. And here you got Trump in there, and you've got Russell Brand, and you have Robert Kennedy Jr., and you have Tulsi Gabbard, and you have Elon Musk, and there's little Brett Weinstein. This is this Jordan. Here's Heather. Not quite sure who that is. And of course, you'll find other characters here. But if you remember, was it the last presidential election when, again, it was about September, and Brett wanted to bring together, like he talked to a general, and he was going to have, we needed a third party or a new party or something like this. And now this is sort of gathered around Trump. And to me, it's sort of like, does Trump do coalitions? I don't know. Trump seems to always do what Trump thinks is best. That's just sort of Trump. It's when you vote for Trump, you sort of vote for his guts, even though the truth is that governing is always a coalition because you can't govern alone. But anyway, I don't want to get into the political side. But again, Jordan sort of named, so on one hand, now again, why are you doing this at the end of September? I mean, the election is at the beginning of November. And you think if you wanted to have this effort to redo politics as business as usual in order to rescue the republic, and even so, rescue the republic, join the resistance. It's like, I think about Pajot's comment about, if you want to found something, don't call it rebel. And I think Jonathan is right. And so what we're seeing is sort of this division of game B, with a lot of former game B players and then others who, let's say, are very much seeing the world in apocalyptic terms. And that's another item on my agenda that I really want to come around to, is to talk about the apocalyptic. Now the apocalyptic does come into this conversation to a degree. But I think we have to think a lot more about the apocalyptic, especially when in this conversation we deal a lot with the eschatological and trying to think about, okay, what does that mean, especially with respect to the apocalyptic? And one of the ongoing issues that Jordan has sort of been working at, which is Matthew Pajot in his conversation basically says, oh, the eschatological, that's just the future. It's like, that's not going to be good enough. because I think Charles Taylor makes a nice argument that time is different, and these guys understand that. So there's a lot going on here. So part of the question is, okay, what is this video talking about? Because on one hand, for John Vervaeke, his friend and really work partner Jordan Hall, even though they're not working in a formal institution, they've spoken a lot. Their friendship has grown. One of the interesting things about Mark Parker released this morning a on-ramp radio, and when I saw the episode 1-1 has Chad the Alcoholic on, it was a top shelf conversation in the corner. I thought it was outstanding. And part of what they're trying to come to terms, okay, what's happening around us? And of course, for Mark and Chad and myself, we're sort of a level down from all of this stuff. We're talking with randos on the internet. We want to have a very accessible on-ramp, and I thought it was an absolutely wonderful conversation. But we're wrestling with similar things, except we very much seem to be on team relational religion, where I would say John Vervaeke is not going to show up in Washington, D.C. to join the resistance. I'm not going to show up in Washington, D.C. I don't think Peugeot's going to show up there. I don't think Jordan Hall's going to show up there, because we've taken the other route with respect to the meaning crisis, the meta crisis, and so, okay, I'm going to say it this way. One of the things that I thought a lot about is that there's always two poles. John Calvin, I'm going to quote John Calvin. I know some of you, I've just triggered you. But what John Calvin says in his Institutes is that knowledge of God and knowledge of self are deeply connected. And some of you might say, what? What? How? What? John Calvin would said that? That sounds almost Silk Roady. John Calvin said that. Because on one hand, and this video is sort of a good way into it, because on one hand, okay, what's the question for John Vervaeke? Of course, among all the Christians, there's all the tension. When's John Vervaeke going to go down the Jordan Hall path? Maybe you will, maybe you won't. But part of what we have to wrestle with is we're struggling with the definition, what is Christianity, for very, very good reasons. And so John, in many ways, attempts to deal with that question with his Silk Road, because his Silk Road can connect Christianity and the religions of the East, Buddhism, Hinduism, Tai Chi, Taoism. The Silk Road connects them. And Islam, of course, is along the way, and Judaism, with its deep relationship with Islam, I think Judaism and Islam are really tight, are very much along the way. And so for John, his Silk Road is his response to this. And in a sense, part of what John wants to say, even though his approach is fundamentally non-techno-political, but rather relational religious, he wants to say, don't pay attention to my profession. In that way, sort of like Peterson. Don't pay attention to my profession. I want to answer these questions up here. And I'm very much going to practice them down here, because they have to be practiced down here to address the meaning crisis. So if you've got the pole of everything per se and all of us as individuals and the lives that we live, there's a polarity there. And where that polarity really gets engaged in this conversation is about at the 50-minute mark, when they really start getting into the personhood of God, okay, and how God relates to the personal. And that very much gets into my God number one and God number two, because God number two is the personal, and God number one is sort of the impersonal. So let's jump into this. And so they're talking, and Jonathan Peugeot very much gets to a point where it's like, wait a minute, this whole conversation needs to come down to earth. And so I want to start there because that's where, in many ways, I think they clarify a lot of this. And then I don't know how far I will get into this. I would love then to get into what I think is the meat of this conversation, which really gets going into the question of a personal relationship with God. Does God know you? Does God love you? Is that language valid in terms of sort of the view from nowhere up here? Because obviously people down here below testify that God loves me, Jesus loves me, and maybe we'll have to get into God number one, God number two. So let's start here.
I think there's also something that this is, and I want to be careful, that people don't take this the wrong way, because I really am a Christian in every way. I really believe Christianity is the fullest revelation.
Okay, so a lot of talk up here. And so now Jonathan Peugeot, and understandably so, Jonathan Peugeot has a burden similar to mine. So Jonathan Peugeot has a reputation as a Christian in a public space. It is important for Christians to maintain their testimony because, of course, the beginning of the book of Acts, and you will be my witnesses. That's the beginning of the book of Acts is, to me, I prefer that to, let's say, the end of the Gospel of Matthew, which is sort of called the Great Commission, which I don't disagree with. But I think actually the beginning of the book of Acts frames it in a better sense, and actually in that framing, especially in the beginning of the book of Acts, sort of launches it, partly because it is at the beginning of the book of Acts. Matthew doesn't have the book of Acts to sort of tie up those loose ends. So, and I have, if Jonathan Peugeot left the Orthodox Church or jumped to the Catholic Church or went back to Protestantism or just even changed churches, would he lose his job? I'm a Christian minister in a confessional denomination that is having one whale of a confessional conversation right now, or trying to avoid it, or just trying to have a fight instead, and all the stuff going on in the Christian Reformed Church that I won't get into in this conversation right now. But Jonathan has just sort of noted, okay, we're having this conversation up here about Christianity, but now I am a Christian. Now, and John Vervaeke, right at the beginning of this conversation, said, I want to really be careful of this dichotomy because we're not going to sort of compare the best Christians against the worst Buddhists or the worst atheists or the worst whoever. Let's not play that game. But yet the tension between Christianity as such, whatever that is, and I'm not saying again that that's not a thing, or it's impossible to talk about its definition. Again, people ask me, what's my definition of a Christian? Someone who trusts Jesus more than they trust themselves. And that's not a perfect definition. It's the best that I've got. And again, I'm a pastor, so I talk to people with IQs less than 100 on a regular basis, whose version of Christianity is so imbued by popular culture and the flow of civilization with everything that's come into it that I need to sort of break things down to something that someone with an IQ of 80 can hear and say, I can understand that. I can agree with that. That's useful for me. So that's my job. And when I make videos like this, I have exposure. And I think this is part of the reason that people have followed this channel, because they understand that I have skin in the game with these conversations. I really do. And at this point, probably 15% of Christian Reformed ministers, 15% of people who are active Christian Reformed ministers in 2020 are no longer going to be Christian Reformed ministers in 2025. Okay? So And in the Reformed Church of America, they went from a denomination of almost 200,000 to a denomination of 50,000 from 2019 to 2024, and they're probably not done losing. So there's a lot going on in my world. And so these, when I say basically Christianity is a tremendously difficult thing to define, you know, someone could, if someone wanted to, take that little clip and say, Paul Vanderklay doesn't know what Christianity is. But in a conversation like this, where John and Jordan and Jonathan, to a degree, are really getting deep into deeply theological questions, well, there's a lot going on here. And these questions are important. And they're not staged or framed in the kinds of ways that, let's say, the systematic theological textbooks on my back shelf are framed. There's not been a lot of writing systematic theology for a while. Michael Horton recently has sort of tried his hand at it. A few other people have tried their hands at it. But systematic theology, in some ways, is sort of a creature of the end of the 19th century, of peak modernity, when they're trying to turn theology into a science in a modernistic way. So when Jonathan Peugeot hits a point in this and says, now wait a minute, I am a Christian, so we're going to take all of this stuff up here and we got to bring it down here, and we got to deal with it down here.
But don't take this the wrong way, because I want to be careful, that people don't take this the wrong way, because I really am a Christian in every way. I really believe Christianity is the fullest revelation. But there's also a more practical aspect, which is that there's a real practical aspect to the idea that we can't be meta. Like, we're not meta practitioners. And I think that's important too, is that.
And that's deep into Jordan's decision to do what he did. And whereas John is exploring the mental pathway, and Jordan's done 2 conversations with Jim Rutt. You can go to Jim Rutt's podcast to hear them. Jordan has been on many channels in the corner, but a big piece of how Jordan Hall addressed the meaning crisis or the meta crisis was joining a church in North Carolina. He didn't get a website that says, rescue the Republic, join the resistance, Washington, D.C. Is that a Sunday? I bet you it is. I bet you it is. Yes, indeed, September 29 is, in fact, a Sunday. I know where I'll be. It won't be Washington, D.C. It'll be in a capital. There's a building with a pretty impressive dome just a few miles north of me. But it won't be in D.C., and it won't be doing politics. Russell Brand, you should be in church. You're new at this. So, on this side of the big fork, we're saying we're going to start with the personal. We're going to start with the personal.
No, the reality of being a Christian is not lived in asking, how better is it from Zen, let's say, right? It's lived in your morning prayers and going to communion and to confession and to, and living it with your family and your community. So that's also like a.
So again, I could play the go to church branding that I play sometimes. You can sit in front of your computer and think all of these thoughts. And again, I'm not making a contrast with John Vervaeke, because John Vervaeke will talk fervently about practice. But so we have these legacy religions, and John has sort of abandoned the religion that's not a religion. And so John's project is the Silk Road. And oh, was it in the, might have been in the Daily Wire extension of this conversation with John Vervaeke and Jordan Peterson, where John Vervaeke made the observation that Jung believed that people probably had to go back to the religion that their traditions that they sort of came out of. So if your family 100 or 200 years ago was a Christian, then probably back to Christianity. If you were raised in a church, then probably back to Christianity. And so the religion that's not a religion, we're not talking about that anymore. There are practices, there are things going on out there, and I've of course got Estuary, which, and again, in my opinion, is church adjacent, and it sounds like we're going to have a conversation. We're going to continue to have the conversation: is, does Estuary have to be tethered to the church? And that's going to be a conversation that we're going to continue to have as this thing grows. But John's main point is, you don't live life in the abstract. On Sunday, September 29, you're either going to be in church or you're not. Now, maybe you're going to go to church and then you're going to go to the rally, or, whatever your Sunday practice is, et cetera, et cetera. Life is about what you actually do. And so, Christianity as such, way up here, go to church, pray, confess, spiritual disciplines, et cetera, communion of the saints.
That's something that can't be completely ignored, right, in the discussion, that although there are probably better people than us to argue like the fine points of theology and of and the differences, let's say, in the metaphysics of the different systems. At least I know that there are better people than me to do that. But there is also...
But yet, Jonathan, my friend, in a sense, what these videos are doing are not sort of having the best, most pristine conversations up here. We're having these conversations between friends. And so this video is modeling that. And when it comes to what this little corner is, this is what we are modeling here too. That is why we are doing this. That is why I should be getting, if I had been smart, I would have worked the whole affiliate program with StreamYard, and Jacob would have too, because I had no idea how much business we would be sending to StreamYard, because StreamYard has become one of the arteries through which these conversations of this little corner is happening. So yes, on one hand, one might say, pick your large-brained theologians of choice out there. But what we're actually doing is, in fact, connecting these two things, because these are three people who are friends, none of whom are theologians, by the way. John Vervaeke is a cognitive scientist with a heavy background in philosophy. Jordan Hall is a disrupted entrepreneur who likes to read theology, and Jonathan Peugeot is an icon carver who loves symbolism and, of course, reads theology too. So none of them are professional theologians, and I am not either. I'm a pastor. Pastors are not theologians. Theologians are academics. Pastors work with people. We touch on theology, but I'm not a theologian. I'm not a biblical scholar. I use the Bible to make sermons. So part of what is happening is that this is a movement. It's very Protestant of me. This is a movement of laypersons who are trying to figure out what comes next. Now, maybe I should just play it. So this happened on the Friday morning live stream, where we're unpacking the event we did in Olympia, Washington. And everyone's opinions are their own. Mm-hmm. And so let me read. Sherry mentioned Nate had seen what I'd written for CRC Voices.
Oh, good.
It's very good. It's good.
Your typical person here, and this is hard for people to describe, to kind of picture, because again, most of this is invisible. Your typical person here probably 8 years ago was a skeptic or a nun or a dun. Now many are in churches, and as one speaker said, I'm amazed that my right brain, that with my right brain I say I'm a Christian, but my left brain is still shocked to hear it coming out of my mouth. Now I did make a meme of that. I said it on the live stream because, and I think a lot of people are right here in this place right now. And Rafe Kelly said it on stage in the conference. You know, Rafe's mouth saying, I'm a Christian. Rafe's right brain looking at that, and Rafe's left brain looking like the disgusted girlfriend in the disgusted girlfriend meme. But that's where a lot of folks are at. Many people, how many people at that conference are now going to church? Maybe 50, 60%, which is a big number for Pacific Northwest especially. But even many of the people going to church, I had many conversations where people, they said, like you said, Sherry, they said, thank you, because I'm going to church. But I feel often in church like a fraud because I don't believe all the things. I have real doubts. And it's really awkward because I go to church. Churches are like, starving babies. They grab anything that they think might feed them. And so, okay, you're going to be on the council. It's like, I'm not even sure I believe in God. Doesn't matter. You're in leadership now. So many are struggling with singleness, loneliness, skepticism and doubt, desire to fully give themselves to faith and the church, but still sort of nursing old wounds and doubts, struggling through trauma from parents' divorces or their own divorce. Many very smart people wrestling with the meaning crisis. Many people there have made real progress in the last 5 years. Lots of testimonies about that. But they came ready to use the Estuary process to dive deep and learn from each other. The whole conference was broken up into Estuary groups of 6 to 8, and everyone, including the speakers, participated. I told Len Vanderslees, Len, you would have loved the whole thing. I don't know if I've experienced a conference with so much power, not just powerful speakers, but powerful things happening with people participating in these small groups. And so the power did come from the bottom. The power came not because speakers were transparent, which they were, but because people opened up themselves, and what that led to was a powerful movement, I'll first say, of spirit, and I do think of the spirit, where people could work on their healing. And so we had in our group, we had one person that about 3 or 4 hours into it disclosed, actually, I'm a therapist by trade. And I thought, oh, and we talked about how I actually have a fair amount of therapists that contact me in deep frustration about their trade. And I'm a pastor in deep frustration about my trade. And he was talking about, the healing that he needed. And was this really like therapy? No, because there's no expert in the room. Mm-mm. And that isn't, again, to demean. I mean, someone could ask, is Estuary, does Estuary belong to the domain of therapy? Because when you're really asking the question, Rod, you're asking, does it belong to the domain of church? And that's why I've always said Estuary is church adjacent. I want churches to host these spaces, and this is Vendonka and I, when we talk to churches, this is the negotiation we have. It's not really a negotiation because it's a hard line with us, is that you could take the Estuary protocol and use it for your Bible study. Sure. But if you're going to have an estuary, if you're going to use that word for it, it needs to be church adjacent. And that's why I don't open and close with prayer. As hard as that is for me, at the end of the 8 hours, I so wanted to close our group in prayer. I so did, but I held back.
Raj closed our session with the Lord's Prayer. So how about that?
We have a Sikh closing this session with the Lord's Prayer.
Did he really? That's amazing.
It is.
The metaphor itself is inherently religious. It's like living as fresh water. But I think it's since we're in Aaron Wren's negative world, that a lot of the times churches are the salt water. I don't know.
Mm,
I don't know.
there
But
is. Nailing it again.
it,
Um,
it seems like they need the life. Like you said, they're hungry. They'll eat you up if you just go into the church, right? but maybe if they come out here, they can feed. I don't know. It's weird.
Well, that's the ossification Joy was talking about, or the preaching to the choir. That's where you don't have the freedom to say what you actually think, because you can only say the statement of faith or the confessions, or else you'll get booted. I mean, or at least they'll listen for a while until you don't get on board, and then you're out.
You know, when you're talking about all this, I'm thinking about when I went to see Martin Shaw actually do his storytelling thing. And I was with a woman who was in her 70s, and she was from an evangelical church. And so for her, it was like, she was like, you know, and afterwards, she was really impressed with it. Like, not just the storytelling, not just the show, but the content of the stories, the audience participation, the way people were impacted, the number of diverse people in the room. And she had a religious experience, right? And so, and we were hashing that out over and over again together. She was trying to figure it out. Finally I said to her, I said, listen, for millennia, human beings gathered around a campfire and told sacred stories. Stories of their exploits, stories of their fears, stories of their hearts, right? That's church. That's what church is or should be. And that's why it feels like church should be, right? And I think that's actually, just listening to you talking about it, Paul, I was thinking that's what's happening in the estuary groups. The only thing that's missing for me is a campfire. An actual campfire.
Well, in the talk I gave in the 2023 Breakwater event, I noted, and you know, you look at the Orthodox, it's like the liturgy, the liturgy, the liturgy. You look at the Catholics, it's the Eucharist, the Eucharist, the Eucharist. You look at the Protestants, it's the preaching of the word, the preaching of the word, the preaching of the word. And I think we're coming into a new era where it's the communion of the saints.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah. Yeah.
We're working our way through the Apostles' Creed. Now, there's a ton in there. And again, I'm a pastor of a confessional church, and I'm happily within my confessional boundaries. But I do see the need for something church adjacent, that people who cannot live with those confessional boundaries can begin to explore. And many, many times when I'm asked to tell the story of how Estuary started, I explain the fact that in my Bible studies, I'm always very careful to encourage a space where people can say what they think. Because so often the difficulty in church is that if you say something against the confession or just opinions of a particular community, even political opinions of a particular community, you will lose status. And so what that does for most people, those who aren't like zero in agreeableness and are just going to say whatever they think, they just shut their mouth, and then they don't have a space to process, and they don't have a space to bring it out with the group and work with the group, which is why, again, and then I know a bunch of church people, I've been doing this for years now, are going to roll in it. Well, what if people think bad ideas? Well, you think they're not thinking bad ideas in their head? I mean, come on. Part of the idea of this is that the thinking should, at least in theory, get better. And for pastors, I say, you should be in those estuary groups. Because if in fact you are facilitating the processing that the people either in your church or in your community next to your church need, don't you want a voice in that? Don't you want what you think is right to be a part of what's going on here? Are you really going to sit in your office and just work on your sermons? I mean, sometimes people ask, and it's not that way at this point, but what would happen at Living Stones if I had 100 people in every Sunday morning for Estuary and 50 people in for church. Would I close Estuary? No. Would I close church? No. Because we're doing different things. But do I want to be in that room? In that Estuary room? Facilitating, contending, being witnesses? Yes.
Also, that other part, which I think is important, which is, like I said, that the Christianity I live is, that's it. It's like I go to church on Sundays and I live my life in relationship with God, and it's something that's real and existential, and I actually, although it has happened in my life where I've had to ask myself that question, about different systems in moments of crisis, let's say, that is definitely not something that feeds my everyday life. Like I don't ask those questions most of the time.
I don't want to trespass.
Most people don't either, because they live in the world that they live in. And
I'm not trying to trespass on that at all. But you don't want that to become a justification of insularity.
No, obviously,
right? Because and this is part of, I think we're
okay. So now we're getting at the tension. So okay, Jonathan has his Christianity. Sherry has her Christianity. Luke has his Christianity. Grail Country has Grail Country Christianity. Mark D. Parker has his Christianity. Chad has his Lutheran Christianity. PVK has his Dutch Reformed Christianity. We've all got these different. Kale has his Roman Catholic Christianity. Jonathan Peugeot has his Orthodox Christianity. And our practices are different, and we're having conversations. And Estuary is a great place that we have conversations between these in the mere Christianity hallway, as C.S. Lewis notes too. And so we need to do this process. I mean, part of what's going on again is we're living in a deeply pluralistic world, and so we have to keep the tension between the things as such, and there's a certain unreality to as such, and this is. There's both a certain unreality to as such, and there's a certain hyper-reality to as such. In that way, when you've got Plato pointing up and Aristotle pointing down, there's something right about both directions, okay? And so we're trying to hold them together. And what's happening as individuals listen to this is they want, so much of modernistic truth, emissarian truth is all sort of up here disembodied. But the reality of life is down here embodied. We're always holding this tension together, and we're always negotiating between them and looking for the ideal, and looking to embody that ideal, and looking to participate in those ideals. But of course, ideals with skin on them have a reality that ideals in our imagination simply do not have. It's the old thing, who said, it was Chesterton, of course, so many Chesterton quotes, the best, something to the effect of the best book I ever wrote, I never wrote, to that degree. And all of us are sort of that way in terms of who we are.
Jordan and I still agree. The world needs to form some kind of common unity, or else we're in a lot of trouble. And it's not going to happen. And now we're in the practical domain now. So we've all agreed, we've left down the theology. It's not going to happen by converting the world into Christianity. At least you've been trying for 2,000 years. It hasn't happened. And so.
And I think this is part of what at least how I heard, I'm never quite sure. What I'm hearing from Matthew Peugeot is what he's saying, but it's evocative enough that I'm getting ideas. Sort of the lock and the key. And so Matthew Peugeot says, well, we had this key and we sort of forgot what the lock was and what the lock is too. And I see that so often with our conversations about God. And that's why, the God number one, God number two thing came up when I listened to Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris talk, because they seem to be talking about different things in some ways. Because this is why when Jordan looks at Brett and Heather and sort of the game be those downstream from Game B on the techno-political side and those who are on the relational religious side, why you have the divide. Because at least for the relational religious side, the question about God is the question about that there's no bigger category. And that's to a degree why this can get so high up here. And so we're trying to hold this together.
So all agreed we've left down the theology. It's not going to happen by converting the world into Christianity. At least you've been trying for 2,000 years. It hasn't happened. And so I have a good inductive argument. And so I think, again, we're now agreed that we've moved into the practical domain. At this practical domain, trying to afford this kind of deep dialogos is, I think, what is pertinent now in that practical domain.
Yeah.
Now, I think it's helpful to talk about the place of the dialogos within a flesh and blood human being. So at Olympia, we had our Estuary conference, and I think for a lot of people, it was a mountaintop experience. But I've been to many conferences, and I've been to many powerful conferences, and I've been to many mountaintop experience church services, and I've had them in private. The challenge is always, when you have the mountaintop experience, what does it mean when you go home? What does it mean in terms of how you treat your spouse, how you treat your children, how you treat your parents, how you treat your neighbors, where you spend your time? What is the practice? How does this transform the shape of your life? And part of the reason we need these conversations, not just sort of whether Jonathan Peugeot says, like maybe I could imagine 3 more wise people than the 3 people on the screen. Okay, fair enough. And many of us down below could say, yeah, well, you 3 are pretty smart and we're connected with you. And so we're listening to you and that's really helpful. So there's a scale going on here because there's the talking and then there's the doing. If let's say you're in an unhappy marriage and you go to a couples therapy and you sit in that little room and you talk and you talk, what happens in that little room, you might come up with some really great answers, but you're going to have to get out there and live them in the kitchen and in the living room and in the bedroom. You're going to have to figure out how to live those things. And so it's always this back and forth. It's back and forth here, and it's taking the mountaintop experience and applying them into your life. And it's part of the reason why you have a church is that you create an arena in which you can not only hopefully have foothill experiences, but you can also have workshop experiences where now you're actually having to get along and deal with people who see the world differently, even if you're within a confessional container.
Well, I think there's always room for learning from each other, and I think I don't think that's not a problem at all. I don't see that as an issue, and you can even learn from other people's. You can meet a Muslim, meet a Zen practitioner, meet a Jew, meet someone who's not in your religion, and find deep admiration of their moral strength, of their faith, of their of how they're transformed by something that is beyond them. And I think, at least in my opinion, I don't think that that's an issue at all for me.
And I think, in terms of the diversity of this corner, that's part of the reason that I want diversity in this corner is because I always saw a certain hypocrisy with respect to this issue. I would see Christians who were in my own Dutch Reformed tradition, which is very conservative, or at least its roots are. I've been reading history of my own denomination. Vendellen, who was about the generation of my great-grandfather, Kuyper, a little bit ahead of my grandfather, sort of half generation in between, let's say, my grandfather and, or between Vendellen and my grandfather's generation. This is an observation that Voltaire made. People who are enormously sectarian. The Hulu show Rami made some good points in this too. You had these ultra-Orthodox Jews working with Rami's uncle, who was also a diamond merchant, and had very strict ideas about all sorts of things, very conservative, even though he was having gay sex with other men. While, I mean, it's just, the show was very interesting. I really enjoyed the show. People who can be intensely devoted to their own very strict religious practice, when it comes into the marketplace and when it comes into the political sphere, have absolutely no problem aligning and supporting people who are nowhere near their confessionality. In fact, sometimes going all the way around to, I mean, Bill Clinton was a Southern Baptist. I would imagine he lost most of the Southern Baptist vote. Jimmy Carter was a Southern Baptist. I think he had it in his first run for presidency and he lost it in his next one. Donald Trump is a thrice married serial philanderer who has a record of, and then, you know, fill in your Kamala Harris card. Go ahead. I don't care. I don't care. You're going to have to vote for someone or you're right in someone. I don't care. But we have a capacity to work with people with very different worldviews in a secular society. This is part of the reason secularity has been in some ways very productive, although its productivity has its limits, and that's part of what we're looking at as we're sort of seeing the edges of liberalism and secularism now. So, but we have a capacity to do this, and in some ways we should probably be doing this. I'm not saying you have to do it at church. Have your confessional church, and I think by all means have your confessional church. Practice your discipline. Catechize your children. Do all of those things. Have your conservative community, but don't act like you're not able to, in the broader public sphere, work productively and negotiate with other people outside of it. And if you can do that with respect to politics or economics, as Voltaire noted, in terms of commerce, maybe we should also have these kinds of conversations. I think that at heart is the core of John Vervaeke's Silk Road. I got a clear picture of his Silk Road initiative in this conversation. And I thought, wow. And as Nate mentioned, if you go back to the Chino conference, I thought at that conference, when he sort of had that moment of exclamation in our conversation on stage, he began to see, this is what I've been doing with Estuary all along, and I do it as a Christian minister. As I've said many times in my Estuary story, I was frustrated. And I still am. Well, actually, I have more conversations than I know what to do with now. Because I wanted to have these conversations with people who were not within my confessional boundaries. And I wanted to have them productive. And I wanted to have the dialogos where both of us leave the conversation with more than we came into it with. And that's not is there danger and risk in that? Absolutely. Is it worth the risk? Absolutely. We, in fact, have to do it, because the truth is, if you don't, at least in an estuary, you're hopefully containing it and creating a space for it, whereas part of what we've seen with the nuns and the duns is that it is going to come in under the waterline and get up into your head anyway. And what we've seen in terms of the march of people leaving in the United States, it's majority Christianity, because Christianity has been such a overwhelming and majority religion. But I would imagine for many Muslim immigrants who come, the same thing is going to happen. And when I watch this show like Rami on Hulu, I think, yeah. They're dealing with the same kinds of issues. And I would much rather bring what I have to the table than what they bring to the table. And so we're having these conversations, and we can have these in a combative, not terribly productive way on YouTube. YouTube has sort of created this space. Or we can have this in a more productive way where there are friendships developing. Not that. Not that. Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? There it is. And I thought, Mark and Chad, boy, Chad brought it to this conversation in terms of taking so much wisdom he's learned from AA. And I think, even though I wouldn't have said it was from AA, a lot of it was from church planting. A lot of, at least the moves that I am responsible for in the corner, these are the decisions that we've made in terms of having a community like this.
And so I think that there has to be ways that we can encounter others and learn from each other and see what's good about other world without it being trying to formulate constantly which world is better. Like,
No.
You see what I'm saying? Like
You just articulated the philosophical Silk Road. Yeah. That's exactly the philosophical Silk Road project.
And of course, for me, it's the Estuary project. And it's interesting that, John and I have been working this, and they know what I'm doing to a degree. And one of the things that we've been doing at our conferences is, and it's always a part of negotiation, but we've at the Olympia conference, the speakers participated in the Estuary groups, and they got a sense of it. And that isn't just to sort of sell. I could easily, I'm trying to think about what I need to be doing here at Living Stones and maybe starting a new thing, within Living Stones. But I could very easily invite John Vervaeke here and not have him give a speech on stage. And he is, I'm sure people would complain because they wanted to meet John, et cetera, because we've got celebrity to deal with. But gladly spend, give him his speaker's fee to have him not speak and just sit in an estuary, because it would be that valuable. And the same with Jonathan Peugeot, the same with Jordan Peterson. I don't care how high up the hierarchy you go, because these guys all have the capacity. Same with Jordan Hall, because these guys all have the capacity. The thing is, if I don't put them on stage, then people won't come, because having free estuary is sort of like having free AA. You can get it all over the place. Not as many as AA, but no, this is right. This is what we're doing.
As you just articulated it.
Yeah, it definitely isn't ideological, right? You can say for certain this definitely has nothing to do with competing ideologies or the desire to create a totalizing universal meta ideology. Right? Definitely not that.
And also, even eschatologically, if you look at the way that's described in Scripture, the idea that all people are going to become Christian is just not there. It's just not in the story. Like, it actually seems to go the other way. It actually seems to go like.
Well, now we'll have the Christian eschatological conversation. So I'm Amil. Pre-Mills would say, no, it gets worse and worse and worse, and that's sort of the dispensational. Post-Mills, of course, will say, oh, it's going to get better and better and better. Every knee will bow. Some will do so grudgingly. But again, now we're going to talk this backward into the apocalyptic and the eschatological, okay? And part of the reality that I try to convince people with respect to Jesus and the church, with misery, deliverance, gratitude, I bring my own Dutch reformedness to the conversation, that when you're saved by grace, I am not John Vervaeke's better. In fact, he's my better in a number of ways, I'm sure. And I'm not Jonathan Peugeot's better. I can't pick on Jordan Hall because his church is at least in some ways reformed, I think. But I'm not better than the other. Now that opens up all kinds of other things. I had a lot of Calvinist thoughts during this conversation with respect to trying to understand why the Reformed perspective took many of the decisions it did. And it's getting kind of warm. We're having a hot day. What's the temperature there? 95. So I try not to turn on too many fans to have too much blowing noise in my office.
Like, you know, a bunch of people are going to become Christian, and then people are going to hate you and they're going to persecute you. So it's not gonna play out like in this. I think that Islam has a more.
What we can say is that so many people's big ideas for how to improve the world had huge unintended consequences, including Constantine, including Justinian, including John Calvin, including John Knox, including the Pilgrims and the Puritans and the American Founding Fathers and the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution and the Nazis. How to say what I want to say. In our little estuary group in Olympia, one of the final things that I said in that group was, because towards the end, people I think were appreciating, wow, these last 2 days were rich. I've received something. I don't know what I've received. I feel a certain way. I'm not quite sure why I feel this way. And then the conversation turned a little bit towards, well, how can we share this with others? And that's a good thing. C.S. Lewis says evangelism in many ways is inner health turned audible. And I think that's right. And one of the things that I reminded them is you can have a estuary protocol, you can have a favorite program, you can have your religious practice, you can have all of these things. But finally, we have open hands and God fills them. And again, I'm speaking this way as a Reformed Christian. That when it works, when it happens, when the skies part, when God speaks, when whatever phrase you want to use for that experience of reciprocal broadening, you can use that word, that God has somehow blessed us and graced us. And God number one and God number two.
Or might have a more of a tendency to think that we're just going to get everybody's going to become this thing. Although Christians have, definitely are evangelized, but I don't see how even in the Christianity's own cosmology, you can imagine that at some point everybody's just going to become Christian, like in the eschaton,
Yeah, I mean,
and again, even just look at the history of Europe. In some ways, in Christendom, in Latin Christendom, did everyone become Christian? There's back to this question of Christianity. Look at the Puritans. Now, of course, my own tradition of Calvinism really worked hard in this, because instead of having super saints in the monasteries and sort of ho-hum saints out there in the fields, the whole idea behind Christian Geneva was help everyone become a saint. We call them all saints, Protestant Reformation. Everyone's a saint. Well, how do we get everyone to perform better as Christians? And I mean, the Reformed tried this as hard as anyone. And again, often I say this, people say, yeah, but the Catholics tried it too. Yes, they did. And I'm sure the Orthodox tried it too. Yes, they did. And that's John Vervaeke's point. We have a long history of doing this, and always with limited success, and sometimes with disastrous consequences. Because, and I think part of this is why, so my tradition has some interesting ironies and peculiarities, because on one hand, we have a confessional system that says, that leans heavily on God's decrees and divine election. And on the other hand, has, in terms of American immigration, invested in the nosebleed percentages on Christian day school and Christian education and Christian catechesis and covenant children only marrying each other. And I mean, before the Second World War, we really leaned hard into this thing. And someone might have looked in and said something to the effect of, well, aren't you people the ones that believe in divine election? Then why do you work so hard at converting your children? Now you can sort of push through and deeper into that and notice that even those who worked so hard on converting their children had many children who weren't converted, or had some children who, right now there's a conversation going on with a guy who grew up Dutch CRC, and it's not Peter Kreeft, it's another guy, Bergsma, who's on Pints with Aquinas. And my mother brought this up to me because she mentioned his father, because in the Christian Reformed Church, it's a big extended family thing. If you were a member of the Christian Reformed Church in the 60s and 70s, you can play Dutch bingo and get a high percentage. But many have left. And so in a strange way, even leaning into the mechanisms and practices and traditions and resources that seek to convert the covenant youth here below accentuates the mysteries of divine election, in that, for all intents and purposes, this person shouldn't be a Christian and they are, and this person should be a Christian and they're not, and we, for the life of us, can't find a formula. And so we say, God knows. We just kick it upstairs and say, that's very God number one. That's very God number one. That's the world he made. That's what we know.
There are Eastern Orthodox, David Bentley Hart, who are Universalists.
In the eschaton, though, he's not a Universalist in Chronos, is he?
Yeah, David, I love David Bentley Hart.
See. Why is Grail Country a part of the corner? Are they safe? They're a part of the corner. So is T-Grog. So is Anselman. So is Chad. So is Grim Grizz. We have a Grim Grizz in our corner. I love a corner with a Grim Grizz.
Hard. I loved his writings for many years. I thought he was amazing. I think sadly he's slipping into syncretism. His universalism is pushing him towards more of a syncretic approach, and so I think that's kind of too bad. A lot of his ideas are still really useful.
You mean bad syncretism, because all religions are syncretist in some fashion.
Yes,
and what John just said there is, this is part of my point. Where hasn't Jesus gotten some of his DNA in? And then you've got the church that claims to have a monopoly on it, and the churches can't agree. And that's not a new thing. That's a very old thing. You can't read the New Testament and not watch Paul wrestle with the Judaizers. And you've got Paul, and you've got the book of James. I mean, to the degree that Martin Luther calls the book of James an epistle of straw. So there's a lot going on in there. And Christians have always had these tensions. And so syncretism, yeah, what do we mean by that word?
But they're not. So everything that exists is syncretist to some fashion, and then it finds unity in the multiplicity. But when you
mean a fragmented syncretism?
What I mean is that when you formulate it as syncretism, like when you formulate it as a kind of as a kind of multiplicity that isn't joined, that doesn't have to be joined in some kind of unitary practice, then I think that's a dangerous, like hodgepodge. I think that
I get what you're saying.
Is very
that would be temptation, right? Temptation, which is the inverse of communion, that which brings a multiplicity into a false unity that is actually just what's that called in material science? Like we take sand. Sand is actually not actually a whole thing if you melt it into glass. It is. Yeah. So something that's interesting just to think about is the degree to which we each have particular callings. We're friends, and I think becoming better friends, which is really fun.
I love it too.
And those callings are distinct.
And again, where is it? That's what this is. We're becoming friends. We're becoming better friends.
And John is called to this philosophical self-road, and that's a thing, and that's a role. It's a critical element of what's going on. And Jonathan is clearly just getting better and better at looking really good on the internet and embodying beauty in a way that's just impossible to avoid. With any luck, right, Mike?
Your hair and scalp can't take the heat. Myth. The fact is, Head & Shoulders Ocean Lift with Sea Mineral Essence formula keeps your scalp and hair invigorated and 100% flake-free through the hottest summer days.
I couldn't resist playing that. That's a meme. That's a meme. And so if you want to see the joke, you'll have to go see the video.
My calling is to retire peacefully and quietly in the mountains of North Carolina and eat barbecue. So it's very liberating, actually, I think, to recognize that if we live the way that we're living, following our calling, and entering into relationships that are truly grounded in this requirement of to love one another, then whatever else is happening, we're doing the right thing.
And I think Jordan Hall just nailed it. I think he just nailed it. Because unless you're... Okay, I'll pull my Abram Kuyper hat out and talk about sphere sovereignty. You have spheres in which you have to act. You have the sphere of your family. You have the sphere of whatever your day job is. You have the sphere of your church. You have a political sphere in which to participate. And wherever you are in that political participation. So again, there's absolutely nothing wrong with going to Washington, D.C. and doing your thing. And they pick a Sunday because thanks to Christianity, Sundays are days when people are more available than any other day of the week, especially on the East Coast, Sunday blue laws. But what Jordan just said there, I think, just sort of nails it. And so John Vervaeke is, working through his relationship with Christianity as he's working through his choices. And Jonathan Peugeot made a movement from the religion that his father, the Christianity that his father moved into. And then Jonathan Peugeot moves into Orthodoxy. And Jordan Hall has now moved into Christianity. And I'm the only one here who's been that I've been this my whole life. And we'll see if my church lasts my whole life, but I've been CRC the whole time. But I think Jordan just really, really nailed it.
Yeah, I'm happy with that. I think it's fair to say that was my intent from the beginning. Right, it was to try and do that. I'm sort of done the problematic I wanted to bring and have you two respond. And again, I think you both responded very well. I genuine dialogos. I got to places I couldn't get to on my own, and that matter to me and make me think deeper. On a more personal note, I'm on a long journey of a kind of rapprochement with Christianity, and this has been I'm not saying I'm going to become a Christian or anything like that, but this coming to a place where I think I can, as much as possible, be healed from just a traumatic apprehension of Christianity. So I wanted to thank you of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, happy we can play a role in that. That's wonderful. Mm-hmm. And so I think this was the time we had allotted to ourselves. I think we came to a good spot. As you know, these conversations, they're always the beginning. They can go on forever. And so thank you both of you for your time and your forthright stance. I really always appreciate it. It's wonderful. And remind everybody, by the way, that I am going to be in Florida with Jordan Hall also. And so there might still be tickets to that event. I don't know. We'll put a link to it if there are tickets to it. But we're going to spend a whole weekend together with a few people.
So, what if I did semi-regular events at Living Stones that were very estuarial? I don't know. That's what I'm kicking around in my head because we've got the space. It's not being used during the week. We've got a lot of classrooms. It would be great. Breakout rooms. I got plenty of tables and chairs. I've got a smallish auditorium where we could fit, 100 people max-ish. And what if I, on a semi-regular basis, I don't know. I'll have to try it once to see if it would work. I would want to do it in such a way that it's sustainable, which would mean all of the administration couldn't fall on me. You know, maybe Living Stones would hire. I'm worried about my deacons getting burned out. Anyway, yeah, I think about that because these events are popping up, and again, I'm doing my event in Connecticut, the Quinbrook Farms Estuary retreat at my sister's place. I think we've got 5 people signed up. The details are now in the full memberships section, so probably this will come out on Tuesday. So Tuesday or Wednesday, I'll release it all the way out, and I'm limiting that to 15. We carry on. We carry on. And you will be my witnesses. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. That's my calling. Leave a comment.